Please note that in the YouTube description we have links to Discord, Patreon, and the sources that I referenced to be able to make this video. Amalie Emmy Noether was a 20th century German mathematician who made fundamental contributions to abstract algebra. Her contributions are still felt to this day in both mathematics and physics. Notable contributions from Noether include Noether's theorems, which resolved a major paradox that had arisen in the theory of general relativity, and making remarkably fundamental advances in the theory of rings. A ring being a set that is equipped with two binary operations, satisfying properties analogous to those of addition and multiplication of integers. Noether was born into a Jewish family on March 23, 1882, in Erlangen, Bavaria, Germany. And despite her first name being Amalie, she went by Emmy for most of her personal life and all of her professional life. Her parents were Max Noether, a mathematician and professor at the University of Erlangen, who came from a family of wholesale hardware dealers, and Ida Amalia Kaufmann, a woman who came from a wealthy merchant family from Cologne. Noether was the oldest of four, her siblings being Alfred Noether, Fritz Noether, and Gustav Robert Noether. Alfred was born in 1883 and was chronically ill for most of his short life, but had the mental energy to receive his PhD in chemistry from Erlangen in 1909. He died in 1918. Fritz was born in 1884 and became very well known for his work in applied mathematics. He immigrated to the Soviet Union in 1933 to escape Nazi Germany, and was executed in 1941 after being accused of anti-Soviet acts. Gustav Robert was born in 1889, and not much is known about him, other than that he was also chronically ill, like Alfred, and lived in an institution most of his life, dying in 1928. The name of Noether's elementary school doesn't seem to be known, other than that it was on Vossstrasse, and that she attended until 1899. From 1889 to 1897, Noether attended the Municipal School for Higher Education of Daughters, where she studied several languages, arithmetic, and was given piano lessons, though she preferred dancing, always looking forward to parties with children of her father's colleagues. Noether didn't initially come off as extraordinary academically, but her quickness of mind was notable from a young age. A classmate of hers recalled a combinatorial problem being asked to kids at a party, and while the other kids were trying to even understand the question at hand, Noether expressed the answer almost immediately. Despite this mathematical quickness, Noether seemed more drawn to language, showing proficiency in French and English aside from her native German. After leaving secondary school, she studied English and French even more to prepare for exams that would allow her to teach, taking these exams in the spring of 1900 and becoming certified to teach in Bavarian girls' schools. At this point was when Noether's interest in mathematics took the forefront, deciding instead of pursuing language teaching that she would much prefer investing her time in mathematics. Noether wished to attend university, but as she was a woman, wasn't allowed to enroll in university at the time, so she had to get permission to sit in on lectures if she wanted to learn, which she did at Erlangen. On top of the mathematics courses Noether sat in on, she was studying for the exam that would allow her to get into any university, passing on July 14, 1903, though she still couldn't enroll. From late 1903 to early 1904, Noether sat in on classes at the University of Gottingen, attending lectures taught by Hermann Minkowski, a 19th and 20th century German mathematician notable for creating and developing the geometry of numbers, where the geometry of lattices is used to derive number-theoretic results. Felix Klein, a 19th and 20th century German mathematician notable for creating their Erlangen program, a method of characterizing geometries based on group theory and projective geometry. David Hilbert, a 19th and 20th century German mathematician, notable for his contributions to the foundations of geometry as well as the foundations of mathematics. And Karl Schwarzschild, a 19th and 20th century German physicist and astronomer, notable for providing the first exact solution to the Einstein field equations. While at Göttingen, restriction on women enrollment was lifted at Erlangen, so when Noether went back home in early 1904, she finally enrolled in the mathematics program at the university with a prime interest in invariant theory, which, classically speaking, dealt with questions of describing polynomials that don't change under transformations from a given linear group. Paul Gordon, a primarily 19th century mathematician who was known as the king of invariant theory, became Noether's advisor, and in 1907, Noether received her PhD. Her dissertation was titled On Complete Systems of Invariance for Ternary Biquadratic Forms, which was computational and ended with a table of about 330 completely worked out invariants. She published a more general extension of this work from 3 variables to n variables between 1910 and 1911. Before we continue with her career, I'd like to discuss Noether on a more personal level. She never married and had no children. Noether was obsessed with mathematics, and it's basically all she ever talked about. Her lectures were quite disorganized, and just so happened to shine in informal settings, such as on walks with her students. Noether really didn't care about how she looked, and cared even less about social conventions that many adhered to at the time. She spoke loudly, with oomph, and could come off as quite abrasive when she disagreed with someone in a mathematical discussion. Nonetheless, she was generally very kind, going out of her way to support her PhD students by any means, even giving them full credit for their publications when she contributed much of her ideas. As mentioned, it was hard to follow her lectures unless you were quite sharp, but the benefit of attending her lectures was that if you did understand what she was discussing, it was ideas that were relevant to cutting-edge mathematics, concepts that she may even have been working on herself, which meant that students had publishable subject matter for research papers that Noether was glad to provide them. After receiving her PhD, Noether really didn't have many options due to most institutions prohibiting women from academic roles. Erlangen allowed her to teach at the university, but without pay. Noether's parents supported her financially as best they could, but Noether struggled quite a bit financially. To ease this financial stress, she stayed living at her parents' home, helping take care of her father, who had grown ill and was growing more so as the days went on. Despite the limitations facing her, Noether was invited to become a member of the German Mathematical Society in 1909. She gave a talk the same year, her lecture being titled On the Theory of Invariance for the Forms of n Variables. In 1911, Ernst Sigismund Fischer, a 19th and 20th century Austrian mathematician notable for his research on orthonormal sequences of functions, arrived at Erlangen and would discuss mathematics with Noether constantly. Fischer ended up introducing Noether to more of Hilbert's work than she'd seen in her brief time at Gottingen, which had great influence on her ventures in abstract algebra. Noether went on to publish papers between 1913 and 1916, which either extended or applied Hilbert's methods to mathematical objects, such as to invariance of finite groups. In 1913, the German Mathematical Society invited Noether to give another talk, this time in Vienna, Austria, her lecture being titled On Fields of Rational Functions. While in Vienna, Noether also met with Franz Mertens, a 19th and 20th century Polish mathematician, notable for Mertens' functions and Mertens' conjecture, which, if proven true, would have implied the Riemann hypothesis. While at Erlangen, Noether advised 2 doctoral students, though they were officially labeled as being under her father. These students were Hans Falkenberg, who received his PhD in 1912, presenting ramifications of solutions of nonlinear differential equations, and Fritz Seidelmann, who received his PhD in 1916, presenting complete set of cubic and biquadratic equations with affect in an arbitrary rationality domain. In 1915, Hilbert and Klein reached out to Noether to return to Gottingen, which was met with heavy opposition from the university's philology and history department, whom were against women holding a professor position. Hilbert found this sexism to be perplexing, defending Noether. Noether ended up leaving for Gottingen in April 1915, with her mother dying suddenly just a couple of weeks after from unknown causes, but is suspected to be related to an eye infection. Her father retiring on top of this, and her brother Franz joining the German army, Noether had to go back to Erlangen to care for her father for a few weeks, before she could really settle into Gottingen. She also continued to advise Seidelmann until he received his PhD, advising him when she come back to Erlangen to visit her father. Despite Hilbert's defense of Noether, she was unable to get pay from the university. Her father pitched in what he could, but Noether lived in poverty for the next few years. Hilbert also had to advertise his name on her lectures so Noether could get students to attend. Though her conditions were quite bad, Noether's mathematical output was potent during this period. The prime reason Hilbert and Klein wanted Noether at Gottingen was because of her expertise in invariant theory, which they needed for understanding general relativity. Hilbert had observed a paradox, that gravitational energy could itself gravitate, which violated conservation of energy. Upon Noether researching this problem, she yielded two extremely important theorems in 1915, which were published in 1918 under the title Invariant Variation Problems. The first theorem, coined Noether's theorem, explains all conservation laws of mechanics, but not relativity. Her second theorem is what ultimately resolved the general relativity paradox, as the time translation symmetry group belongs to an infinite dimensional variational symmetry group matching the conditions of the theorem, thus yielding the triviality of the conservation of energy. The first theorem is almost solely what people reference, with the second theorem getting little to no representation. This is probably due to the wide application of the first theorem, which applies to all continuous symmetry groups, whereas the second theorem only applies to certain kinds of infinite dimensional symmetry groups, such as gauge symmetries. These theorems were huge, as physicists were now able to propose abstract symmetries, knowing there must be a conservation law attached to each of them, and they could then figure out the conservation law. Einstein wrote to Hilbert, giving Noether high praise, stating she knows her stuff. And Klein went on to present Noether's theorems at a meeting of the Royal Society of Science in Gottingen on July 26, 1918, presumably not presented by Noether since women weren't allowed to be members. In 1919, Noether was finally granted professorship at U Gottingen. This was due to a combination of the aftermath of World War I and Hilbert and Klein having fought heavily for Noether's professorship to be granted. Alas, she still wasn't being paid, but was getting closer. After 1919, Noether moved away from invariant theory to focus on ideal theory, which is the theory of ideals in commutative rings. In 1920, in collaboration with Johannes Werner Schmeidler, a 20th century German mathematician who was an advisee of Noether during his habilitation, the pair published a paper that defined left and right ideals of a ring. In 1921, Noether published Ideal Theory of Rings. The paper was of remarkable importance, yielding an extension to the prime factorization theorem called the Lasker-Noether theorem, which states, every ideal in a commutative Noetherian ring can be composed as an intersection, called primary decomposition, of finitely many primary ideals. Emanuel Lasker, a 19th and 20th century German chess player and mathematician notable for introducing the notion of primary ideals, had proven cases of this theorem in 1905 for polynomial rings and convergent power series rings. Given the coining of Noetherian ring, it became common to attribute other mathematical objects as Noetherian, which all describe objects that satisfy chain conditions on certain kinds of subobjects. At the end of 1921, Noether's father died, leaving her a small inheritance, easing her poverty just a bit. In 1922, Noether received a letter from Otto Bulitz, the Prussian Minister of Sciences, Art, and Public Education, stating that he was giving her the title of an untenured professor with limited internal administrative rights and functions. This was certainly an upgrade, but she still wouldn't receive pay until 1923, when she received the title Lecturer of Algebra. In 1924, Noether published Abstract Composition of Ideal Theory in Algebraic Number Fields. This work provided conditions on a ring that allowed her to deduce, in such commutative rings, every ideal is the unique product of prime ideals. In 1926, Pavel Alexandrov, a 20th century Russian mathematician notable for his contributions to topology and set theory, came to give a lecture at U Gottingen. Noether and Alexandrov ended up becoming great friends, with Alexandrov referring to Noether with the masculine der Noether, to show how much he respected her. Noether even attempted to help Alexandrov become a professor at U Gottingen, but it was to no avail. Nonetheless, they still met quite often while he was there, discussing the intersections of algebra and topology. Though Noether didn't directly research topology, she shared ideas that were pivotal in the development of algebraic topology. This influence took the form of discussions, such as those with Alexandrov and with Heinz Hopf, a 20th century German mathematician notable for his work in topology. After attending a few lectures of his on combinatorial topology, Noether suggested to Hopf that he replace his traditional use of Betti numbers and torsion coefficients with homology groups. Noether also included a blurb in a 1926 publication where she mentions topology as an application of group theory. Her suggestion of studying topology algebraically was adopted almost immediately by the likes of Hopf, Alexandrov, and others. From 1927 onwards, Noether's research primarily focused on representation theory, publishing a fundamental paper on it in 1929, and noncommutative algebra. Credited with founding the theory of central simple algebras, alongside Helmut Hasse, a 20th century German mathematician notable for his contribution to algebraic number theory, Richard Brauer, a 20th century German mathematician notable for being the founder of modular representation theory, and Emil Artin, a 20th century Austrian mathematician, also notable for his contributions to algebraic number theory. In 1927, Noether and Brauer published a joint paper titled On the Minimum Splitting Fields of Irreducible Representations, which introduced the Brauer-Noether theorem, giving a characterization of the splitting fields of a central division algebra of a field. In 1929, Noether published Hypercomplex Quantities and Representation Theory, a work which proved to be of remarkable importance in the development of modern algebra. The paper joined the representation theory of groups and the structure theory of associative algebras into a single arithmetic theory of Noetherian modules and Noetherian ideals and rings. Noether ended up giving a talk on the results of this paper in 1932. Between 1930 and 1931, a Dutch mathematician named Bartel Leendert van der Waarden published a 2-volume work titled Modern Algebra, which is the first comprehensive abstract algebra text and what van der Waarden is best known for. Noether's work laid the foundation of the second volume, of which van der Waarden had become enamored with when he visited Gottingen for an academic year in 1924. In 1932, Noether, Hasse, and Brauer jointly published a paper titled Proof of a Main Theorem in the Theory of Algebras, which introduced 2 theorems that allowed one to classify all finite-dimensional central division algebras over a given number field, first stating a local global theorem that led to the main theorem. This same year, Noether and Artin jointly received the Alfred Ackermann Teubner Memorial Prize for the advancement of mathematical knowledge. In 1933, Noether published a paper titled Noncommutative Algebras, which showed all maximal subfields of a division algebra are splitting fields, and introduced the Skolem-Noether theorem. With Noether's collaborations, awards, and increasing invitations to give talks, she was beginning to get the recognition she long deserved. But 1933 was a year that would interrupt this comfortable progression, with the rise of Nazism throughout Germany due to Hitler coming to power in January. Noether kept relatively calm, continuing to teach at Göttingen until April 1933. She would even let members of the brown shirts sit in on her lectures, giving the students the benefit of the doubt, trusting they had no malice towards her and were interested in just studying mathematics. After she was let go from Göttingen, she would have students come to her home to discuss mathematics, which did include her brown shirt students. As it became more dangerous for German Jews in 1933, Noether had 2 ideas of where she could escape to: the University of Oxford in the UK, and Bryn Mawr College in the US, of which Einstein and Anna Wheeler helped procure, Wheeler being a 20th century American mathematician, notable for her contributions to functional analysis, as well as eventually becoming the chair of mathematics at Bryn Mawr. Noether's first choice was Oxford, but they were taking too long, so Noether ultimately decided on Bryn Mawr, being granted a 1-year professorship. She sailed to the US via ship, and arrived in late 1933. Given Wheeler's push to get Noether to Bryn Mawr, the 2 women became friends and worked happily together during her time there, and she received support from the college president Marion Edwards Park, a 19th and 20th century American academic administrator, notable for initiating cross-institution collaboration between Bryn Mawr and a few other universities. Noether also befriended another visiting mathematician named Olga Taussky-Todd, a 20th century Austrian mathematician who published 300-plus papers on algebraic number theory and matrix theory. From late 1933 to early 1934, Noether taught a winter seminar running through van der Waarden's Modern Algebra, which was attended by 3 students and 1 professor. In February 1934, Noether began giving weekly lectures at the Institute of Advanced Study in Princeton, New Jersey, and in the summer of 1934, after a trip to Germany to visit Artin, as well as her brother Fritz, Bryn Mawr extended Noether's professorship by 1 more year, allowing her to stay in the US. In April of 1935, doctors discovered a tumor on Noether's pelvis, leading to a surgery on April 10th. Doctors removed a massive ovarian cyst and left behind 2 smaller tumors they deemed benign, so as not to prolong the surgery. 3 days after the surgery, she seemed like she was recovering wonderfully, but on the 4th day, she fell unconscious due to a fever of about 43 Celsius, dying later that day. The doctors weren't sure why this happened, but attributed the death to an unusual and virulent infection that triggered the fever. She died at age 53 on April 14, 1935, and her body was cremated. Her ashes interred under the walkway around the cloisters of the M. Carey Thomas Library at Bryn. After Noether's death, a small memorial was held at Park's home on Bryn Mawr campus, which was attended by people such as Wheeler, Brower, and Towski Todd. Towski Todd joking that she now had some claims to the female championship. And in the following months, Noether also began getting written tributes from the likes of Einstein, van der Waerden, and Alexandrov. Noether received very little recognition during her lifetime, but in passing, her recognition has been immense, the weight of her work still being felt today by mathematicians and physicists alike, and has been given homage in forms ranging from scholarships, fellowships, and even satellites. Well, there you have it. A brief history of another remarkable mathematician. We'll end on a quote from Einstein, printed May 4th, 1935 in the New York Times. In the judgment of the most competent living mathematicians, Fraulein Noether was the most significant creative mathematical genius thus far produced since the higher education of women began. In the realm of algebra, in which the most gifted mathematicians have been busy for centuries, she discovered methods which have proved of enormous importance in the development of the present-day younger generation of mathematicians. If you enjoyed the video, please click that like button and subscribe. And if you generally just enjoy the content of this channel, please consider supporting on Patreon. As always, thank you for watching, and I'll catch you next time.